Martinez. Welcome once again to Shaftesbury Society, coming to you live from Midtown Raleigh, North Carolina. We have another great one on tap for you today. So glad you're along with us. You know, there's been so many disparate political movements lately that we all have paid attention to over the past few years. Things like the Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, along with the political successes of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And all of these things seem to have a common theme, a theme of frustration with the status quo. And part of that, according to one of our researchers here at the Locke Foundation, really stems from the difficulty in accessing opportunity in order to get ahead in life, something obviously we all want every person to be able to do. Another component is a stubborn reality that we have to face in this country, and that is that 1 in 8 people still lives in a household that doesn't earn enough to stay out of poverty without government assistance. So today we're going to be talking about these very important issues and sometimes sensitive issues as well. We're going to look at strategies about how to give more people more access to opportunity and talk about the need to actually retool government policies so that we can remove any barriers that are holding people back. We've got a great panel of experts for you today. Joining me for the conversation, Adam Millsap is the Senior Fellow for Economic Opportunity at the Charles Koch Institute. Craig Richardson is a professor and director of the Center for the Study of Economic Mobility at Winston-Salem State University. And my colleague Joe Coletti is the Senior Fellow in Fiscal Studies here at the John Locke Foundation. We're also hoping sometime this hour to be able to connect with Jerron Smith, who is with the Center for Advancing Opportunity. So for now, Adam, Craig, and Joe, welcome. Glad to have you all along. Appreciate you being here for this discussion today. Gentlemen, I'd like to start if we could just get your kind of overall perspective and comments on the challenge that we're facing today in extending opportunity to every person, not only here in North Carolina, but across the country. Adam, let's start with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Donna, for having me. And Joe, I really enjoyed the paper. I think you hit the nail on the head broadly with this idea that we've made poverty easier to endure over the last 40 or 50 years, but not necessarily easier to escape. And that's one of the things that we've been discussing a lot at Stand Together in the Charles Koch Institute, where I work, about how can we make it so that people can get out of poverty rather than just living within poverty. When you think about America, we don't have kind of the dire poverty that you see in some of the third world countries, developing countries and stuff like that. But we have a lot of people that live, you know, with roughly $10,000 to $20,000 of resources, and they struggle to get by, some combination of under the table income or a part-time job, as well as government benefits, and they're kind of stuck in that position. I'll let Craig talk about that more, because I know he's more of an expert on these disincentives and how the government programs work, and I know you touched on that in some of your paper as well. But I think that's kind of the crucial thing that we need to look at. How can we help people get out of this living day-to-day kind of on this combination of government benefits and part-time work or under the table work and all this kind of informal economy stuff, and get them a bridge to the market economy so that they can experience that same upward mobility that so many previous people have experienced when it comes to poverty, moving up into the lower middle class, upper middle class, and who knows, eventually even the high income earners, right? So I still think America is still an upwardly mobile society. Michael Strain at AEI writes a lot about this, and I think he's right. But there are definitely too many people that aren't able to take advantage of the market economy that we have, because either they can't get their foot in the door. You talk about this with the minimum wage in your paper, right? The minimum wage cutting some people off from the get-go, so they can't get that first job. That will then lead to that second and third job as they move up the income ladder. Or they have that first job, they have that minimum wage job, but they happen to have kids who they need to pay for childcare or something like that. And so getting that raise from, $15 or $14 an hour to $20 an hour, well, it sounds good. And we're like, why wouldn't you do that? By doing that, they actually get less real resources that they can use because they get these benefits cut. So I think, your emphasis on breaking down barriers and how we can help people, get the bridge to that market economy and be upwardly mobile, I think is really important and really crucial. And the conversation I don't think enough of us are having today is too focused on redistributing resources, just shuffling things around rather than thinking about growth, the rising tide lifting all boats and getting back to this economic environment of robust economic growth.
And we really wanted here at the Locke Foundation to focus in on all of those things. And so, in fact, a lot of those themes, Adam, are what Joe Coletti has really focused on in his new paper that we are talking about today. It's called Thriving in North Carolina, Justice, Opportunity, and Barriers to Economic Mobility. And in fact, my colleague Brene Goforth is going to be posting a link to Joe's paper in the comments section of our Facebook page so that you can access it there. Professor, what's your take on all of this? How do we extend opportunity?
Well, first of all, thanks again for inviting me to this, and I really appreciate the opportunity here. You know, as I was reading Joe's paper, I kept coming back to this idea. I'm calling it a listening paper. And by that, I mean that what Joe has done a great job of is writing a paper that has policy reforms that make sense, but at the same time, I could give this paper to some of my most intelligent liberal friends, and they wouldn't be turned off by this paper because it's clear Joe has addressed a lot of the types of concerns that liberals have about market dislocation, about injustices, about difficulties of climbing the ladder. And there's a tone in this paper that I think invites lots of points of view rather than simply discarding, you know, this is my way or the highway type of writing. And so I think as that sort of my first take on this is that what makes this paper different and very valuable is that I think you could really give it to anyone from any political or economic persuasion and they would all come away learning something from it. It's inviting and it's a listening paper. There's a lot of echoes in this paper in the community that I live in, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where we also suffer these divides between the rich and the poor. And it's where our center, the Center for the Study of Economic Mobility, was really founded on figuring out how to improve economic mobility. Like Charlotte, which is infamous for having some of the lowest economic mobility in the country, our county of Forsyth County, where Winston-Salem is located, is third from the bottom in the entire United States. And yet, what we both have is a paradox because to the uninitiated, driving into either city, it looks like a thriving city. It's really a tale of two cities. And so what I think Joe has done a great job of is identifying sort of the invisible side of this problem of folks who have not. The other things that I think that are really important is, you know, I think about my grandparents who came from my mother's side from Germany. My grandmother came when she was 16, immigrated by herself. My grandfather came when he was 20 to New York City, the classic immigrant story, and they left behind a lot. And they came here for all this opportunity. And by standards of today's measures, they would be considered in poverty. They were living in a flat, which, you know, they had to pay for coal. They had no hot water. They had to work very, very hard. But what they had that I think is missing today is that they had access to economic networks. All right, if you lived in New York City, you could easily find hundreds of thousands of jobs, even without having an automobile. They could simply by the notion of working hard, you would feel like you would move up. And so we have, I think one of the things we have done, and I think to our detriment in this country, is we define poverty in terms of a level of income. And what we have not done is talk about poverty as an absence of hope and an absence of access to networks. Because in my travels around the world, whether, you know, I've been to Vietnam or Zimbabwe or Honduras, one of the things I look for is, are they hopeful? Do they think their kids are going to be better than they are? And so I really see in our communities and in the communities of Charlotte, where we've taken away hope, I think that's really the true poverty, not the level. When we say, oh, people are sort of living okay, that's not okay. They're motivated, but those rungs of that economic ladder in many cases have been sawed off. And Joe has done a wonderful job in really discussing how we might rebuild those rungs and not assume those people are lazy. No, they're just as ambitious as my grandparents. They simply just don't have those rungs to climb up on.
You know, Joe, in your paper, which again is called Thriving in North Carolina, Justice, Opportunity, and Barriers to Economic Mobility, Joe, you write up front that it's not a traditional public policy paper, and I think the professor has really captured that quite well. Joe, you also write that with government policies the way they are, that in some ways it's a barrier to self-reliance because those policies have made a bad situation more tolerable. You call for a humbler role for government, more focus on access to opportunity, and an embrace of community. Joe, talk to us about the key themes of your paper, if you would.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the paper, Donna. So thank you for hosting this, and thanks to Craig and Adam for joining in and for the kind words that they've already had. So I appreciate that. And also, you know, to make a paper like this happen, everybody at the Locke Foundation has a role in that, and our donors obviously allow us to do this work, since we talk about markets. And we rely on markets to be able to indirectly get us to allow us to do our work, but we're not actually selling products. So we have to always express the gratitude for their generosity and investment in what we do, which signals that they believe in what we're doing as well. So and as both Adam and Craig talked about a little bit, and as your question gets to, the role of economic opportunity in a just society is something that is critically important. And so, and I start with the paper talking about Charlotte, because, like Craig mentioned, it was the worst city in 2014 for economic mobility, according to a study by Harvard economist Raj Chetty and his team. And just to put that in perspective, though, worst out of 50 meant that they had that if you're born in the lowest economic quintile, you have a 4.4% chance of making it into the highest economic quintile. The best city was San Jose in that study. And for somebody in the lowest quintile, they only had a 12.3% chance of making it into the highest quintile. So we're not talking about a big gap between the high and the low there. In a way, Charlotte was blessed by being 50th, because that provided that sense of crisis that San Jose, with barely any better economic mobility, didn't have. They got to congratulate themselves. Charlotte got to say, we're in a crisis. We're failing our own citizens, and they've had task forces in 2017 and 2020 take a look at what is it that we as Charlotte can do. And one of the things that struck me in the description in the task force paper from 2017 was how much of Charlotte's situation, and you can make the same case in Detroit, where I grew up, in Boston, in Los Angeles, and every city kind of in between, how much of that lack of mobility and that lack of hope is a result of government efforts to, in most cases, try to help. You go back to the 30s and the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, which was kind of the predecessor of the Federal Housing Authority, which backs most mortgages now. And that's where the redlining idea comes from, that they took a look at neighborhoods. They said, this is a majority African-American, majority Black. We can't finance in there because Black neighborhoods drive down, are low in value. And if a Black person moves into a white neighborhood, that's going to drive down the property values in that neighborhood. And so they wouldn't even finance an African-American family looking to move in someplace. Not only that, but they wouldn't finance a white person looking to rent their home out to an African-American person. So, and that led to that kind of kickstarted, and it's not about the racism of individual families, because you had people who were willing to sell and willing to rent. It's about the policy in government that enforces this on both white and Black owners in those areas. And once the property values are kind of locked into that downward self-fulfilling policy prophecy, when you have economic development with new highways, where's the government going to build roads? It's going to go through the lowest cost neighborhoods, which would then be African American neighborhoods. And when you have the neighborhood being severed by a highway, and when you take a look further in the 60s, 50s, and 60s at where do we have slums, and where do we have low value places and dilapidated buildings, and how can we improve those? Again, they went into Black neighborhoods, tore down existing functioning neighborhoods, and replaced them with dysfunctional projects. And the fact that they even called them projects indicates what was going on with that there were more experiments on people in some ways than attempts to actually build on what was working. So that, and we have, and we've mentioned a couple of the other policies that go along with that, minimum wages, which are intended to provide people with a step up, but often take away that first rung of the ladder, because the people who are most affected are those with low skills, and especially the young. And if somebody in Thomas Sowell, who's from Gastonia, so always have to reference the great North Carolina economist, he said there's not correlation of what happens to Black employment after minimum wage increases, which falls. You have far fewer African American, especially young African Americans, employed after a minimum wage increase. So it doesn't necessarily imply causation, but it's a really big coincidence to say that it's just that there's no causation at all in there. So all of these policies kind of also illustrate a point that Nathan Glazer made in 1971 when he said, every piece of social policy takes over, at least in part, the role of the family, of the ethnic and neighborhood group, or of the voluntary association. And in doing so, social policy weakens the positions of these traditional agents. Exactly what Craig was talking about, that we weaken society, take away all of those things that allowed our forebears to be able to advance up the economic, to advance economically. And that's the story of Charlotte. It's the story of America in the 20th century. And so now we get to take a look at how do we get those barriers out of the way so that people can advance on their own.
That's so important, because one of the issues that I find really fascinating is the lack of generational wealth creation that occurs in minority communities compared to white communities. And that's so important, because that's where you're able to ensure, by passing things down, that your children and then your grandchildren have a better life, in some ways at least, than you did. And it also embodies to me that people are more able to reach out and pursue their dreams and be successful and find something that works for them, that they can support their family with, and then also become more of a family legacy. And so I kind of wonder about that connection of generational wealth and legacy wealth in relationship to these public policies. Gentlemen, am I off base, or is there really a connection there?
I'll jump in on that, but there's a clear connection, and there's a book out from the Brookings Institution, Know Your Value, which ties back to what we were talking about with housing value, that African American neighborhoods, similarly situated economically to white neighborhoods, have home values that are 30% lower, and that's part of that the legacy of that redlining and the other government policies along the way that have taken away that opportunity to build assets in your home, the biggest investment for most folks. And for those people who end up on government assistance for one reason or another, there's the rules for that assistance also limit the amount of assets that you can get. Not only does it, as Craig and Adam both talked about, limit your ability to take that next job, because you're going to be cut off from the assistance if you take higher pay. But if you try to even save the money that you're earning from that, you can for most programs, there's a $2,000 asset limit. And if you're just holding on to $2,000 in cash, that's barely enough to get you through a car repayment, to get through a major car repair, or to get through a major medical emergency. And so you can't even be able to get to that next step and provide yourself with some margin to breathe and to make the decisions that you want to be able to make to take care of your family. So yeah, asset accumulation is extremely important on both home ownership and government programs and everywhere in between. And I'm sure that Adam and Craig will have more ways that it works on that side.
Yeah, I can build on all that Joe's talking about. One of the things we were looking at in our county, and as Joe mentioned, like many other cities, our Route 52 runs north and south and bisects our city. The eastern side primarily Black and Hispanic and much poorer than the west side. And it's really did that exactly what Joe was talking about, is upending a business district, et cetera, et cetera. Here's something else that I found pretty fascinating and sort of dispiriting was, I looked at what was happening to property values across Winston-Salem over the last 15 years, particularly after the financial crisis. And one of the things that was, as we all know, housing prices collapsed during the 2008 recession for the next following years. But on the west side, the wealthier side, the whiter side, those housing values bounced back. And on the east side, they've actually continued to decline. And I started investigating, well, why is this so? And one of the things that I found out was that there has been regulatory overreach with the Dodd-Frank banking reforms to this extent. During the financial crisis, it was identified that there were a lot of mortgages that were given to people who didn't know what they were getting into. They were signing these for low-income folks. They were getting mortgages they couldn't afford, right? Those mortgages blew up, they lost their homes, there were a lot of foreclosures. Fair enough. So the regulatory commissions came in and said, we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So we're going to strictly regulate banks, and we're going to limit what they can charge now for mortgages. Now what's happened is that banks now have fixed costs. So the cost of a $500,000 mortgage is the same as a $50,000 mortgage. And now that they put a cap on mortgages, banks have basically left the market for small mortgages. So if you look at mortgages for $70,000 and less, now people in Washington, D.C. said, no, you can buy a shed for $70,000. There are, as of we speak of right now, there are 30 homes in Winston-Salem that are less than $70,000. However, there is only one person or type of person who can buy these homes, and they are cash buyers, because there are no mortgages. There are very few banks that will do this. Why? And we're doing this through a small mortgage project, which we're partnering with New America in Washington, D.C. We're investigating this, and bankers are telling us over and over again in real estate is we will not do that. And actually, I found the same exact thing with me. I wanted to buy a condo for my daughter instead of paying rent, and I was turned down for a $70,000 mortgage. Not because my credit was bad, but because, quote, we don't do that. It's not profitable. So Joe's point about this and Donna's point about wealth building is that traditionally, if you think about my grandparents who started off with a starter home, we know about Levittown and all these other starter homes, which were very inexpensive. This avenue, this first step, is now not available to low-income Americans anymore. They are consigned to being renters for the rest of their lives because they cannot get into a mortgage and use sweat equity the way we used to do it and buy a $50,000 or $70,000 home, put a lot of sweat equity into it and sell it for $120,000, in a few years, and then move to the next place. And so we're working with on this project to really articulate how this law, in my view, this regulatory pendulum that was meant to help poor people has swung way too far in the other direction, and now is preventing people, and the only people who can buy are all cash buyers who, in many cases become slumlords and they're seen as the villains, but they can't sell it either. So we have declining property values. When I started my original question, why are property values declining? Well, it's like an auction where you're not allowed to use your credit card. You can only use the cash in your pocket. We know if we were at an auction selling rocking chairs, those rocking chairs would be a tiny fraction of the other one auction where people had credit cards. And so it's not a mystery anymore to me.
Professor,
why we have property values and why people on the East Side don't even want to invest in housing. But it's once again, I think the theme that Joe's bringing up, these are a lot of invisible things that are happening below people's radar. There's a lot of emphasis, let's build more public housing. We need more affordable housing. What I'm finding out, it's really the demand side is the problem.
Professor, what you're describing is tragic. You're telling us that people cannot get into a starter home because the financial industry has been so overregulated that it won't actually provide the loan, even if a person could justify, yes, I have the income, et cetera, to buy this $70,000 home, for example. They can't get a mortgage.
Right. I mean, I sort of, a good analogy is this one. If we go to a convenience store, we want to buy like a single item, let's say a roll of toilet paper. That roll of toilet paper is going to be more expensive than if we go to Costco, where we buy in bulk. And everybody gets that, right? Now imagine if the government said, well, the convenience store is ripping people off and you need to sell that roll of toilet paper for exactly the same price as Costco. We know what would happen. The toilet paper would vanish from the shelves of the convenience stores. So we have to think about large mortgages like big rolls of toilet paper. They're cheaper by the dozen, right? Right. So to understand that a small mortgage is more costly and it's okay for a bank to charge a little bit more to offset that cost, it's not an evil institutional problem. It's a normal thing, and people would be willing to pay a little extra so they could actually get into their mortgage.
Adam, what the professor is describing to me is the classic example of, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And because all of this regulation, the over-regulation of the financial services industry is always messaged by the government bureaucrats as consumer protection. But now it's keeping people out of the opportunity to actually own something and build on it and have appreciation and pass it on to their kids.
Yeah, I think Craig's point about the financial regulation and stuff like that being a hindrance is absolutely correct, and we should do what we can to lower those barriers so that people can get these $70,000 mortgages. But I also want to be slightly contrarian here a little bit on the idea of home ownership as a way to build wealth. I think that is the current mentality in the U.S., and I think it creates other problems in the housing market when everyone views their home as an investment. So that it appreciates over time. That makes people erect more barriers. And I think Joe talks about this in his paper a little bit, more barriers around zoning, right? You want to limit the supply in your neighborhood in order to have your house appreciate. You don't want an apartment building to move next to your home because it might devalue it because you have so much wealth tied up into your house. So I think more generally in America, I think, home ownership has some pros and cons, right? And I think renting has some pros and cons. I think we should be careful about putting one on a pedestal and then saying like the renting is bad and the home ownership is good and we should all drive towards home ownership. I just recently bought a house. I can speak from both sides of this issue. And like I said, I think we get too protective of our homes when we start thinking about it as investment. You see this is exactly what's happened in California. I think in San Francisco, right? People have these bungalows that they bought for $200,000 25 years ago that are now worth $1.2 million. And they refuse to allow additional housing to come in and erode that value because that's their retirement. They're going to sell that home. They're going to move to Arizona or they're going to move to Idaho. And so I think we need to be careful about creating this mentality across the entire US that the home should be the main store of value that you're using to save and transfer wealth, right? I'd like to see more people think about how can we get involved with financial assets? How can we involve in equities with bonds and thinking about intergenerational wealth transfer through those kind of assets that can appreciate over time because companies are becoming more productive, right? They're figuring out ways to lower costs and create more output. Whereas homes, the appreciation is primarily driven on the demand side, right? If you live in an area that's not in high demand, then your home's just not going to appreciate. But relying on that demand to always be there, I think is just a pretty, sketchy way to think about investment and thinking about retirement. So I'm less in favor of thinking about homes as a way to transfer wealth. I think of homes as a durable consumption good that depreciate over time. They're not real investment. They're something you should live in. And they have some benefits that you can do what you want with your property, right? Which is all great and good. I think that's fantastic. But like I said, I don't think home should be the way that people think about creating value for themselves long term when it comes to retirement or transferring assets to the next generation. They should think about ways to diversify that rather than tie up everything in their home that I think creates these other perverse problems on the zoning and land use side.
Yeah, just to go with that, the perverse incentives in the land use regulations that limit ability to, it's not just the ability to purchase a home, but it limits the ability to use your home to generate cash flow, to turn it into a business. We have a number of regulations against the ability to even have a business in your home, let alone what some cities have been moving to liberalize, which is accessory dwelling units. I always think about Happy Days. I grew up, I'm of a certain age where I grew up watching Happy Days, and Fonzie lived above the garage of the Cunningham's house in Madison, Wisconsin. That's part of how they made their budget work to raise two children as a pharmacist and be able to get by. Families don't have that same kind of opportunity now, whether that's the homeowners association or the city's regulations that limit that ability. We have regulations against renting your home out on a short-term basis through Airbnb. So if you think about your home as just another part of how do you get ahead and how do you build margin in your life, so that if you can get it paid off, then you're not paying $1,000 a month into your mortgage, but you now have $1,000 a month that you can pass on to your grandchild or to your child to help with their finances, and thinking about but it's extremely difficult to be able to leverage that and turn that into cash flow in the short term so that you can purchase a house in the first place. And it makes it difficult to be able to be able to what we've been doing for a lot of us in the professional classes for the past year, work at home, right? If you're doing something besides sitting on your computer, there are rules that limit your ability to do millinery work, to do dress work and to do tailoring at your own home, something that has no impact hardly on your neighbors, yet is still regulated and makes it difficult to be able to start a business. And that business could be something that you pass on to your child as an asset and have them take over, or be able to sell that client list to somebody else. So those are other ways to think about home ownership and asset creation that are also off limits right now.
You know, what you're talking about, I think, Joe, is what we commonly see referred to these days as side hustles, of people who are doing something out of the house. Maybe it's an idea, and they're trying to figure out if they can make some money at it. Sometimes those things don't work. Sometimes they do well, and they can become, your primary income maker. Professor, I suspect that you, spending a lot of your time with younger people, are you finding that they support market economies and freedom to be able to earn a living, but they don't really realize that what they're supporting is market economics? They think of it as a side hustle. They don't understand the public policy implications yet, which you, I'm sure, are trying to imbue on them.
Oh, I think our students are very entrepreneurial, and they're very interested in how they can earn a living, and they have these dreams about starting small businesses. So we've seen that personally. In fact, our Center for Study of Economic Mobility has supported some of these student-run businesses and mentored with them, and they, like other students, have big dreams, and so that they're very pro-market in that sense, and they don't want to end up receiving government benefits if they can help it. Some of them have come through that, and they've seen the debilitating effects on incentives and moving forward. So there certainly, I think, there's an energy around markets, I would say, for sure.
Well, that is good news for sure for those of us who are in the business of talking about free markets and advancing those. Joe, one thing that I thought was fascinating as I read through your paper was your emphasis on opportunity and extending opportunity to everyone, particularly groups in our country that have been marginalized for one reason or another over the years, and sometimes just exposing someone to a new idea or something that they hadn't even thought of can be the genesis of them, taking a particular path in their life. And I know that, Joe, in your paper, you actually quoted R. Shea Cooper at the beginning of your paper. And oddly enough, I had, previous to your paper, Joe, bought the book A Most Beautiful Thing by R. Shea Cooper. I'm about halfway through it. Folks, if you haven't read this book, it's really interesting. The true story of America's first all-black high school rowing team. It's a great story. And Joe, what really, really I am learning from this book, and the fact that you quoted R. Shea Cooper, is that sometimes we forget that not everyone has been exposed to certain opportunities to be able to make a choice. I mean, R. Shea's description of some of the things that he grew up in his family in Chicago, a very poor family, and he had drug-addicted family members, etc. That's not my experience, thankfully. I grew up poor, but I didn't have those other issues in my household. So just exposing people to opportunities.
Yeah, and I was a rower in college, and a former teammate of mine introduced me to the movie. There's a documentary narrated by Common, and the book Most Beautiful Thing, and to put yourself into that position, right? If you grew up middle class, you don't think about how do I survive tomorrow.
Right.
But if you are, Shea talks about the violence on the streets around him and trying to navigate his way from his home to his school in the 15 gangs that you have to cross the territory of from one place to another. And his friends, some of his friends fall into that. And all of that, the exposure, it's I talk about margin sometimes, that like, what's if you look at somebody who's created a business, they have some margin built into their life, from their parents, from their neighborhood, from, like you had mentioned, Donna, the opportunities that they've been exposed to through their school or through some other thing, somebody who's invested in them. And that's something that we fail often to talk about properly. And that's, you mentioned that I say that this is not a typical research paper, because normally a policy paper, you jump into the what, right? We've got the problem of the minimum wage doesn't help people. And so we're just going to talk about there's a bill to pass a $15 minimum wage, and we're going to forget why this is a bad idea and just talk about what's bad about it and why we don't, and what we should do instead. And you lose people in that process because right, the reason why somebody might why a minimum wage is bad is because it limits that opportunity to get that first job and limits your exposure to work, and which can have long-term impacts. That I listened to an interview with Mark Cuban, who has made billions in the tech industry, and he said, when he looks at somebody and whether he's going to invest in them, he looks at how much of have they been an entrepreneur since the time they were 6, right, or to the time they were 10, because that's what you're looking for, is that experience with things. And that's something that if you don't have that first exposure, if you don't have that positive exposure, then it's hard to find a positive thing in your life. If you don't have a positive exposure to markets, because everybody that you're around is either the only market that you see working is a drug market, like R. Shea talks about, then what do you think about in terms of, I want to be an entrepreneur and I want to make money and I want to be able to accomplish things and take care of my family? He became a cook, he became a chef, but that's because he was exposed to things. And so that's where sometimes people get who in our circles don't like when somebody talks about giving back, right? Because your business is giving in the first place. But if you think about what it means to invest in that next generation, that is kind of like the only way that we're able to accomplish something is because somebody invests in us. We don't do anything on our own. And so there is that part of it that's giving back what you've been given in the blessings that we have.
And it also gets to the role of community. And Adam, community is so important. I mean, in the freedom movement, we talk about, private enterprise and the role of community groups and family and church. That's where that first exposure comes from. If you have someone along that line of people that you interact with when you're young, someone who takes an interest in showing you something or making sure you are exposed to something that you aren't likely to be exposed to unless someone says, hey, I'm specifically going to take this child to an art museum, or I'm going to specifically take this child to a college campus. And it's so important. It's not all about government programs to try to lift people up.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea that people respond better to people that have similar past experiences to them, right? When they see somebody who came from the same area or who have gone through a similar life experience and they see that they achieve some kind of success, it really makes it more tangible to them that like, oh, I could also do this, right? I could also achieve that kind of success. So I think those kind of role models, those kind of examples are really important. And the broader point about social capital, I think is really important too, which is why I'm so skeptical of federal government solutions, because I just don't think the federal government has any idea about what the people in Charlotte need in order to generate social capital and those kind of bonds that people have in communities. I don't know that the state government does either, but I think they have a better idea than the federal government does, and the local government probably even has an even better idea. So when it comes to government intervention in these kind of ways in order to like help build these bonds and reinvest in communities and stuff like that, revitalize communities and those kind of connections that people need to have, I think the best thing the federal government can possibly do is just redistribute resources, right? They can put resources down to the local level, the state government level, the local government level. And if there's going to have to be government programs, they need to be run at that level, because the federal government, the people in Washington, D.C., the people in Northern Virginia where I live have no idea what the people in Idaho need, right? They just have no clue. And so I think we need to think about that social capital and building those bonds, because like as Joe's saying, I think that's crucial. One of the groups we partner with at Stand Together, the Family Independence Initiative, they've recently rechanged their name, but Mauricio Miller started the organization, and it's all about bringing people in to have some social capital and then just giving them cash and allowing them to use it in the way that they see fit. Let's assume that they know what they need, to, reach that next level of success, rather than like top down try to tell them, oh, you need a car or you need a house, so we're going to give you a housing voucher, or you need more food, so we're going to give you this kind of in-kind food assistance, right? It's about giving them resources. They use their social capital to hold themselves accountable, right? Your friends and your peers are looking at the way you're spending this money in order to move up to that next rung on the income ladder. So there's that social capital accountability that exists, but then it's trusting them and empowering them to know what they need and know what they want in order to achieve their own success, the way they view it. And I think, the federal government just doesn't have that level of granularity or that local knowledge to be able to do that effectively. So I really think we need to think about, getting more the nonprofit sector needs to get involved. Like you said, the private companies can have these kind of programs and everything like that, where you provide some of these resources and opportunities for people. And to the extent they need to partner with government, it really needs to be local.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting. And Joe, you actually, in your paper, after you talk about the Charlotte situation, and you also talk about minimum wage, which we've touched on here, and why, even though that's a trendy, popular idea, and it seems to me certainly there would be some people who would benefit immediately because that particular person would be making more money, but the implications for new job creation and who actually benefits, many times those policies simply don't help the people that they are purported to help. But Joe, you also get into some very specific nuts and bolts for here in North Carolina that gets at this issue of making sure that people have the most opportunity they can possibly have to getting a job and to earning a living. And we have a situation in our state where we have all sorts of trades and skills that require specific licensing. And many times the time and the money that is required to invest in getting that license before you can go out and actually put your shingle up and start earning a living, it really prohibits people who are vulnerable economically in the first place from taking that first step, getting onto that first rung? What should we do?
Well, the easiest thing to do, well, I mean, the simplest, most straightforward, is to simply eliminate occupational licensing. Because the studies that have been done on it, that have taken a look at those issues, almost universally find that there is no benefit to public health. The big benefit is to the people who are able to get over that barrier. And usually it's the first generation, the people who create the license in the first place, who exempt themselves from the new testing barriers, the benefit the most. And then once you get in and you have higher wages because you've now limited the ability of others to compete against you. Unfortunately, it locks people into their job and into their place as well. So we have in North Carolina, up until recently, military spouses could not transfer their license to North Carolina. And so that left, and that especially hurts women because they have some of the more transferable jobs skills that, among in the marketplace. So whether that's healthcare or teaching, things like that, that have explicit licensing barriers, that then you have to go through another round when you move to a new place. That's one of the things that the state has been good about, is removing those barriers for military spouses. They can expand that out so that we have universal recognition of licensing, which is before the legislature right now. And what the Institute for Justice has talked about is that there are tiers, there are levels of limitation that you can have, and the license is the most restrictive form of intervention that the government can have. And so there are ways that you can ratchet that down so that it is less intrusive and less costly for somebody to be able to get that license and still be able to do work.
So what you're really talking about is finding a better line between people making sure that a product or service that they're buying is safe and that they're not going to be hurt by it, but at the same time allowing that person who has that skill to not have to go through hours upon hours of training or to pay for certain applications or licenses or things like that. Because nobody wants to think that, oh my gosh, I'm going to go get my hair cut and I'm going to walk out, it's going to be chopped off because this person has no experience or anything like that. But you're saying there is a balance. There's a better way. We've just got to find that.
Right, and to the point about the harsher, some of the higher barriers are to low-skilled jobs and to things that and that's where the real imbalance comes in, is that if you have that it takes more training to become a hair braider or a barber than it does to become an EMT. Not in North Carolina, but I've been looking at recently at Louisiana, because I've been looking at jobs for women and the effect of occupational licensing. You have to be licensed in Louisiana to become a florist, and a florist means somebody who mixes flowers, as opposed to, anybody can sell a specific kind of flower. Anybody can sell carnations in a bunch, but if you're going to sell carnations with baby's breath and with roses, that takes a florist, and you need a license for that, because
the
who knows what's
consequences
going to
could
happen.
be dire to that. It could be really ugly, right? If you mix the wrong two things, which I would probably do, but yeah, and things like that just don't make sense. And we can chuckle about them because they are funny, but the reality is that there are real people who are prevented then from having that job, making a living to put food on the table because of a law or a regulation like that. And so that's why we talk so much here at the Locke Foundation about the need to reform our occupational licensing regime in order to allow people to simply go out and earn a living, because we all want that to be able to happen.
And Donna, just to go to something even more specific with that is second chance hiring. And for those people coming out of prison, there are programs in prisons to teach people skills, welding and a variety of other things. And there are entrepreneurial programs here in North Carolina. You have Inmates to Entrepreneurs from the Brian Hamilton Foundation that they that where they go through, where the inmates go through and figure out what they would start a job, what they would start as a business, and they come out with those entrepreneurial skills because they've been away for a long time in some cases. But there are within occupational licensing, so many licenses have a barrier to somebody with a felony record or somebody, regardless of whether it's related to the occupation that's being licensed or not. And if you get convicted of, or if you have that, you've practiced the occupation without a license, well, then you can never practice that occupation again. And so that's a double barrier, because somebody coming out of prison is more likely to be poor and is also going to be struggling to get back on their feet. And now they've got the job market, the regulations in the job market working against them.
Yeah. Hey, I'd just like to jump in here too. And I think here in this part of the paper, the idea of taking away licenses, I'm picturing my good liberal friend here in the room here. And the first thing they're going to say is, oh my God, that's scary, right? Because you're going to have people running around with no licenses. And how do I trust this person? And so I think in order for this to be successful, if we're talking about lowering barriers and taking away licenses, we have to replace one thing with another. And by that, I mean, how do we keep assurance? How do we keep trust, whether or not it's the person cutting your hair or the dental hygienist or whatever? And we know, the literature talks about reputation, right? And reputation can be that trust builder. And long-term, certainly we know if we're going to buy a used car from somebody, I always ask, how long have you been selling these cars? If this guy's been doing this for 10 years, he has a reputation to lose if he sells me a bad car, right? And so one of the ways that, and this wasn't mentioned in the paper, but maybe it's something for you to consider, Joe, is we think about other areas that have done this so well. And I think about Airbnb. What a crazy idea if you think about it. Airbnb, think about pitching this to investors. I'm going to have people open up their homes and have complete strangers come into your house and stay between 1 and 5 nights. And you don't know who they are, where they're from. And are you up for that? Will you invest in that venture? And when you say it like that, it sounds crazy. And yet Airbnb has been enormously successful without any licensing of anybody in their homes. And they've done it through this reputational system where the consumer gets rated and the supplier gets rated. And we both care about our ratings. Neither of us want to get a bad rating, right? And this has of course worked well with Uber as well, where we have people who are young moms are driving taxi cabs, which we would have never ever thought of would be possible 10 years ago. In the middle of the night, they're driving Ubers, right? Feeling safe because they can look and see who there's going to be in that car. So I would say, that would be an extension of your papers. If you're going to take away something, we have to convince our liberal friends that we're not just opening this up, but we've got to say, yeah, I know you've got a trust problem. Okay, here's my plan. Here's how I'm going to replace one loss of trust with another, right? And here's how you can trust.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If I could just jump in real quick, and I think that's a great point. And then the way technology is making it easier to do these reviews, right? I mean, we have Yelp, and you have a million things when it comes to businesses, a way to review them. You talk about Uber and everything. So I think that's absolutely true. And also, we undervalue, I think, sometimes the other mechanisms. Like you mentioned the pyramid and stuff. We undervalue like insurance, bonding. All these other things that you can do in order to protect the consumer if something happens to go wrong. And I think we need to highlight those examples a little bit more, because I think a lot of times people don't differentiate. They think someone might have a license and they don't realize that it's just insurance and bonding that they have instead. And the Mackinac Center has a really good presentation that they do where they present different occupations and say which one's licensed and which one isn't. And they're occupations that are very similar. Like it might be like the framer of your house versus the person who puts the siding on. Which one's licensed? The mason versus the bricklayer, which one's licensed? And they seem like they're very similar jobs. And you're like, well, I imagine if one is, the other is, but often they're not. It can be really weird, distinctions between why one's licensed and one isn't. So I think the more people become aware of the type of occupations that are licensed and which ones aren't, and the variation across states, I'm hoping that they'll start becoming more open to the idea that we don't need to license all these things.
Well, speaking of being open to ideas, Joe, as I mentioned previously, you write in your paper, which, by the way, folks, you can actually find that in the comments section of our Facebook page. You can find a link to it, or go to johnlocke.org and you'll see it right there, Thriving in North Carolina. How do we open people's minds and hearts to new ideas? The professor is talking about his liberal friends, and how do we get people to maybe listen to ideas coming from right of center, and in reverse, how do we get those of us on the freedom right of center side of things to maybe open up our minds and hearts to an idea that's coming from left of center? Because clearly where we are right now, after decades of federal government intervention, state interventions as well, we're still dealing with people who are having trouble escaping poverty. So that seems to say we need to think a little bit differently and maybe take some different actions. How do we go about that?
Well, the first step is for those of us who are listening and who are supportive of the Locke Foundation, is for us to make the decision to listen. And I appreciate that Craig saw this as kind of a listening paper. That wasn't a goal of mine, is that even though it's a speaking paper and like a paper you have to be speaking, but to make it more of an open invitation. And I've heard this and I've seen this, that I think of Esau McCauley, who has a book. He's a theologian, and he talks about, in his book, it's called Reading While Black, which is about reading the Bible as a Black person. And he says, he means African Americans in seminary. When they go to seminary, the church that they come out of agrees theologically with those fundamentalists. But when they get to seminary, the person who is listening to them and the situation that they're coming from is progressive. And so where are you going to go? You're going to go to the person who listens to you. And so if we can listen more, take grandma's advice, right? We have 2 ears, 1 mouth, so we listen more than we talk. If we can do that, and when we do talk, recognize where the person is coming from, and engage in the truth, and try to get down to that bottom part of the why behind things. That's the only thing that works. And to be open-handed and open-minded when we have these conversations, and have them as conversations, and not as that we're going to take Adam started today's talk with, I'm gonna take this down your throat, right? I don't think Adam said that though. But right, it's not combat. It's looking for what's the best solution here. And so that's the place where we have to start. And to the extent that opens somebody up on the other side to walk into conversation, and maybe both of us can leave that saying, I had some bad, I started with some misunderstandings, or I started from some bad assumptions about where the other person is. We've all been accused of being evil in the first place, right? There are reasons why we advocate our positions, is because we don't care about the African-American person. We don't care about women. We don't care about the poor. We don't care about all these folks. That's the starting point that people come into this with. And so the more that we can get back to what's the fundamental truth, and and where are you, the idea, the phrase that people use now is, I see you, right? I know, I see you and I hear you. I don't necessarily like the language of it, but that's the place where we have to start.
We're obviously in a very polarized society, and not just politically, but socially and culturally as well. Adam and Professor Richardson, how do we get people, including ourselves, to be open to different ideas?
I don't know if I have any good answers to that, but I think I would say that this is why we need more experimentation and more federalism kind of ideas at the local level, right? I don't know that we know what the right answers are, and I don't think the right answers will be the same across the entire United States. So I think we need to, push things down to that more local level, quit looking to Washington to solve all of our problems and to do everything for us. I think both the state and the local leaders need to do the same thing, though. I think too often they look to Washington and say, hey, we need resources. We can't do this on our own, give us something. But that always comes with strings, right? The money is never just there given, strings free, right? So you got to think about those kind of things. So I think empowering, the people at the local level, to Joe's point, listen to what these people are saying that they need, and let's figure out how we can provide those resources and those solutions for them, and quit looking outside for that kind of assistance for someone to come and save you.
Yeah, and my English teacher used to tell me everyone has a story, and to the extent that we don't cast entire groups of individuals as thinking the same way. I think that's, unfortunately, we do that a lot, that there's, well, that demographic thinks that way because maybe, a significant portion voted for that individual, therefore they all think that way, and I think, for example, the folks who voted for Trump or the folks who voted for Obama, well, it's unfair to say they're all the same or they all think the same way. Could be very complicated reasons for why that happened. And so, I definitely echo what Joe and Adam are saying. Listen to the individuals, start from the ground up. And then we have things to offer too, right? So, I mean, the phrase that's fashionable now is, listen to people with lived experience. And I totally agree with that. At the same time, I think our economic tools can be incredibly valuable for pulling back the veil of some of these invisible phenomena that may not be readily observable. And that's, why I love economics. There's a little bit of magic in economics. My dad was a magician, actually, and an economist. And I understand the connection between the two of them because our tools can give us some tremendous insights that others may not have. So I think doing both of those are very important.
And in fact, that's what Joe's paper really does. Joe's paper talks a lot about specific steps, a pathway forward to trying to make sure that everyone has greater access to opportunity. But he also puts it in perspective historically, talks about what's happened in the city of Charlotte. And it's a really non-traditional policy paper, and I would encourage you all to take a look at it. You can find it at johnlocke.org or in the comments section of our Facebook page. It's called Thriving in North Carolina: Justice, Opportunity, and Barriers to Economic Mobility, written by my Locke Foundation colleague, Joe Coletti. Also joining us today, Adam Millsap with the Charles Koch Institute, and Professor Craig Richardson with Winston-Salem State University. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure, a really interesting conversation. Thank you for being part of it today.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, guys.
And folks, thank you for listening today as well. We always love it knowing that you have tuned in because you're curious, because you want a better North Carolina, because you do believe in opportunity and not equality of outcome. You do want people to have access to be able to choose how they want to live their lives and go forward and be productive and be fulfilled in their lives. That's what we are all about here at the John Locke Foundation. We believe in freedom and choice and opportunity. If you like what we're doing, I hope that you would also consider making a financial contribution to help fuel our work. We are a nonprofit organization. We do rely on you. It's very simple. Please just go to johnlocke.org, and in the upper right-hand corner, there is a donate tab. Just click on that. It's secure, takes you less than 2 minutes to make a tax-deductible donation to help fund our work here at the Locke Foundation. And if you choose to do that, thank you so very much. We hope you will come back next Monday for another edition of Shaftesbury Society here from Midtown Raleigh. On behalf of the entire John Locke Foundation and Carolina Journal team,